Everybody, my name's Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. I have experience with these steps as they're laid out in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with sponsors that have done the same work out of the big book. And I've made all the amends that I can make. I live my amends today, and I practice 10, 11, and 12 to the best of my willingness, because it's always about my willingness. And thanks for asking me, Kathy. I'm nervous. God, I can't believe how anxious I am up here. You know, my sheer on this step, and I think on all the steps, has changed over the years because my experience has changed, you know, with this work. So for the newcomers, just sort of keep this in mind, that like where I'm at and where I was are two very different things. When I first came here and they were talking about this step, I think there's just no way I'm ever going to get to this point. It's just nearly impossible. That's overwhelming, because you're talking to a fear-based alcoholic. The thought of having to look at the damage that I did in my active disease and then having to go out and repair that damage was just beyond my comprehension. But it's interesting, with this work and the development of a spiritual experience, the courage comes to be able to make those amends, right? And to live differently. Really, this is what this is about. So how my share is today is that my amends are done, right? So I'm not in the active stage of writing out amends and making amends, but I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's about living my amends today. How am I different, you know, in the world? And I am different, and I'm not perfect. So I falter. And that's the reason why, you know, we have step 10, right, which follows this. But the steps are in line for a reason. I mean, they really sort of seamlessly move together. I didn't put my time on.
Oh, I didn't either.
Time for 20 minutes, yeah. So I think about, you know, step 5, and, you know, how many, I had to do like more than one step 5 because I did this work and I relapsed. And I relapsed because in fear. I mean, I wasn't doing an active 10th step, and I did that a couple times. And I really, you know, really it takes what it takes to get to the place of humility, because that's what this work is about. It's really about accepting the fact that I'm flawed and that I'm human and that I'm just another bozo on the bus, and we're all on the same journey, and that I'm not unique or different than anybody else. So getting to that point, I think, is essential, because I think most alcoholics think they're kind of different from everybody else, right? It's an arrogance, it's sort of a narcissism, that somehow we're delusional in that way. And that had to be smashed for me, because living by self-propulsion just created so much havoc and discontent in my life that set me up for failure in so many ways. And in many ways, most of that failure was in my interpersonal relationships with the people that you know, that I came in contact with. And so, you know, we see that in step 5, you know, where it says, you know, by this point we're trying to get a new relationship and an attitude with our Creator. So by this point I have, hopefully, if I've gotten to this point, that I have an understanding that there's something bigger than myself, and I've come to believe in that power in a way that's going to carry me even in those moments in time where I don't think they will, you know. That's the faith, right? The faith is sort of believing even though I don't feel it. So you get to this point, and I begin to read the 5th step. I begin to look at those character defects that sort of caused my difficulties, and you know, we get an understanding of the weak items in our list, right? And what are those? Those are sort of the character defects, which are my selfish, dishonest, and self-seeking behaviors, trying to live by self-propulsion. I just want to feel good. I want a quick fix. You know, people know my story. I didn't start using actively alcohol and drugs until I was in my 30s. But I can tell you the alcoholic mind was there from a very young age. I threw a lot of things at that restless, irritable, and discontented state of mind and body. And then eventually, you know, chemicals came into the picture, and I just took off with them. And, you know, and we know where that goes. But, so, you know, 8 and 9, so why? Like, why do an 8 and 9 step? You know, because I think that if we're looking to continue to develop humility, we need to be honest. And part of that is cleaning up the past, right? So we finish 5, we do 6 and 7, which 6 and 7 for me is such a pivotal step, 2 steps, because it takes us from the past, right? And then it moves us into the present, right? And how we're going to continue to live. So I understand that these defects of character get in the way of my living and in my relationships and the way I am in the world, but I can't necessarily get rid of them on my own. So I have to trust that this power greater than myself is going to help me with that. And there are moments when I'm, presented with opportunities, to practice these principles, right? And I'll falter. But that's where the learning comes in, right? And that's why we have the latter steps. So I get to this point, so I move from understanding kind of in a rudimentary kind of way what my problem is in my 5th step, and then I start moving into the present, and that's cleaning up the past. This is sort of the last vestige, I think, of moving forward. We begin to own our side of the street so that we can move forward in becoming helpful to others. And until I get to this point, I can't be of maximum service, right? Because I'm still stuck in self. All that stuff is still there. Although the channel's opening up, I got to continue to clear it out, right? I got to make things right. And that's where the 8th and 9th step come in. I make a list. I make a list of all persons I had harmed and became willing to make amends. It doesn't mean I do it right away. I think I become willing, and I pray for that willingness. So the sponsor that took me through this work initially had me break it into 3 different parts: personal, family, friendships, professional, and financial. And those are the 3 categories. And I would put my amends in those 3 categories. He didn't have maybe, never. Because basically what he said to me is, you're willing to go to any lengths for victory over alcohol, and you'll make all those amends at some point. You need to be willing to make those amends, if not now, later. And it's interesting because as we continue to make the amends and we continue to develop a relationship with a power greater than ourselves, those most difficult amends seem less difficult to make. That's why this is a process, right? It's not a one and done thing, it's a process. So we begin to clear up the past and live, a spiritual life. And so we do this. Why? Because the alcoholic leads the double life. And we need to get some psychological and emotional relief, right, from that bondage of self through the behaviors that I was, living, when I was active, and even when I wasn't. I think back to before I used alcohol and drugs. I mean, my behavior wasn't exemplary, right? It just wasn't, and I didn't think that because I always thought alcohol and drugs was the problem. Once I get drinking and drugs under control, I'm going to be okay. And I think many people feel that way. I mean, we always come in thinking it's just the drink or the drug. That's the problem. I had no clue this was a spiritual disease. I had no clue that I had a spiritual illness and that I had to really develop a relationship with the God of my understanding to solve that, and that's the reason why I would hit a wall all the time and pick back up again, because I didn't have the spiritual solution. The euphoric recall would come back, and when I ended up with that restless, irritable, and discontent, and I didn't have a relationship with a strong relationship with the God of my understanding, what was the solution? The only solution I had was a drink or a drug, right? And I would go to it, and I would create that delusional thinking, I just need this for this moment in time, forgetting that I have the phenomenon of craving, right? Which is the other piece of it, right? So understanding that I have the first part of step 1, but really having to accept the fact that the problem is not necessarily the drink or the drug. It's about the thinking process in my spiritual malady. So I begin to clean up the past and move forward. And, the beauty of this work is that, it gives me psychological relief, so I don't feel the pressure to want to pick up a drink or a drug. It also, it repairs relationships, right? Living the amends. I was told that when I started making my amends, that I needed to do the low-hanging ones first, right? The people that were in AA that I might have driven to a meeting with under the influence, that kind of stuff, to kind of get my bearings and to develop some confidence in doing it. And then, go out to the people that are closest to me, like family and really close friends, and and then begin to make those. And in many cases, it does repair the relationship because, I'm living differently today and people can see it. Even with my family, in spite of the relapses, they saw there was a difference. And I came right back and I started to do things differently this time around, not pointing fingers and blaming, right? So it does improve the way that I am with other people and the people closest in my life. It restores integrity, right? Like people start thinking better of me. Like I'm a man of my word. That's important, right? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you do for a living or how much money you have. Your word is really the only thing you have, right? That's pretty much it. And then that continues with the moral growth. And so it really is, moving in a direction of humility and vulnerability, right? Because if I'm not living in a state of humility, then I can't be of maximum service to God and to my fellows. That is the purpose of this work. Because I'm thinking about me, right? And I do that. I think about me. So continuing to stay humble allows me to be helpful because I'm remembering, where I was at certain points in my life, right? And I don't forget that because I'm never better than. I'm just one step away. Well, I like to think maybe I'm many steps away from picking up a drink or a drug again. I'd like to believe that it would take a little more than just a step. But I have to really, be vigilant because for me it's a process. That spiritual malady can be restored with lack of spiritual principles, right? It can be replaced. I could end up, and that's what happened, that, I go back and I start taking my self-will back, and I'm not talking about the things that are getting in the way. And then the old thinking begins to creep in, and it tells us in here, the insanity of alcohol returns, right? And that's what happens. If I don't stay spiritually fit as a real alcoholic, because I'm a real alcoholic, there's a difference. They tell us the different kinds of drinkers in this book. So, making amends, so I made the list of people, and, I don't know if I'm going to, there are some amends that were more profound than others. I'm going to tell you about the one amend in particular that I made that really shook me to my core. I remember I have a friend, still have a friend, that I've had for 35 years. She was part of a family intervention. She, saw me before I was actively addicted. She saw me move through addiction, and we're still friends today, very close. And I never forget when I made my amend to her and we sat down. And again, making an appointment to do that so they know that we're not just springing this on them. She said to me, "I was afraid you were never going to make it back." I'm like, wow. That's something. Because, see, I knew I was sick, but I didn't realize how sick I was. That's the difference about alcohol. When you're in the disease, you don't realize how sick you are. And look at how many people die of this illness, right? Because they don't realize how sick they are. And so that really struck me. It was profound. And, my family was an interesting, both my sisters, I think I've shared this many times, that I had a sister living in England at the time. She had just had a complicated pregnancy. She had an emergency C-section. She has a special needs child. My father had just died. They couldn't get back. I was out of my mind, just reeling and nuts. And she called me up, and I was ranting and raving about my mother and everything, and not even thinking about her, right? Not even thinking about, here's a gal who can't even get home to her own father's funeral. She just had an emergency C-section. She's living in a different country with a special needs child, right? And so I sat down and made my amend to her, and she told me some other things, like the follow-up question is there anything I left out? And she said yes. And she listed some things, right? And they were things that I had no memory of at all. And then when we finished up, she looked at me and she said, "When you make your amend to Nancy, she'll have more." And she did. They had really had it with me. I got to be honest with you. I have such a close relationship with them today, and it's a relationship based on honesty and integrity. I'll give you an example. So this is how we fall back into stuff, right? So I got my sister's birthday is going to be on Monday, though. She lives in Maine. They have a house in Mexico. And my sister, who lives in Westboro, she said, we're gonna go to Mexico together on Monday. We're gonna fly out. So Nancy's gonna come down Sunday. We'll have a birthday party for her, and then we'll fly out that morning. So we know what's going on right now in the country, right, in terms of flight. So I said, well, you guys still gonna go? She said, yeah. Like, okay. So I made all my plans and my arrangements, organized my weekend around it. And then I got a phone call this morning. Yeah, change of plans. We're gonna drive up to Maine on Sunday. I'm like, I'm not driving anywhere on Sunday because, I already got plans, and I'm not going to try to get in early tonight so I can be up early tomorrow, and then I start thinking about me, right? Me, and then I start getting angry. And I'm like, they don't really care about me. They don't think about me. It's always about them. Nobody works. I'm the only one that's working, and I'm going on and on and on in my head, and I'm like, take a deep breath. You don't have to go to Maine. All you have to do is say, look, this isn't going to work for me, right? It's not going to work for me. I called my mother up. I said, it's not going to work. Can you come by after church? She goes to church here. She drives from Westboro to here to go to church. I said, can you stop at my house and pick up the cake and my present? She said, I can do that. I'm like, okay. Then I called my sister, and she said, I completely understand. She said, I know it's been a change of plans, and I know that you have to go to work on Monday, and you don't want to do that. I then come back, and yeah, see, but if I didn't have this work, I'd be like, you guys really don't think about me at all, do you? You just think about yourselves, none of you work, and then see how we set the ball rolling? Yeah, I don't do that today. Usually, most of the time. So, yeah, made a lot of financial amends. Those are the easiest because, I don't like parting with money, but I didn't have to really look at, the behavior of really intimate relationships. They talk about, being married. I was married, never unfaithful. There was never unfaithful, but it tells us when it comes to alcohol and drugs, we're incredibly dishonest and selfish. And that was the truth, right? Incredibly dishonest and selfish. Sweet relationships are broken. And that's what happens with this disease. So, how do you live different today? If you're in a relationship, you just try to be different in a better way, right? That's the living of the amends today. And just, that's all I can say in terms of where I'm at, in terms of my process, is that today I just try to be different. The past is cleaned up. I'm living in the present. I falter. But that's why we have the follow-up step, which is step 10. And it tells us that the spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it, right? Living it's a lot of work because it's messy. Life is messy. And I need to know that it's not always going to be wrapped up in a nice little neat package. Like this morning, right? It's a process. But I have something here, a process, in a program that helps me stay sane, right? And I go to God, I say, give me the strength, to just stay focused and not be reactive, because it's not always about me, right? And setting boundaries and limits is not unhealthy, It's being right-sized and being reasonable in how I approach things. That's the difference today. Listen, I was not like this 23 years ago when I came in here. This is different. It's all these years. This has been a process. So that's my experience. Thanks.